All right. Good morning. Oops. Good morning, Michelle. That's from yesterday. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday. Just a quick reminder, for you, there's no class on Friday, which I think you knew already. Did you know? No, didn't know that? Okay. Yeah, there's no class for you on Friday. It's a professional development day for teachers, so I get to be professionally developed, whatever that means, and you get to sleep in. So enjoy your day off. I'll be thinking of you while I'm working hard. Um, yeah, so don't forget about that. No class on Friday. Let's see. So Ryan is here. Good morning, Ryan. Shania's here. Good morning, Shania. And Abby's here. Good morning, Abby. And Simrat is here. Good morning, Simrat. All right, let's hop into where we were yesterday. So, the last few days we've been talking about the social construction of race in Canada, and we said that it's very easy to look at the United States, especially with all of the conversations they're having about race now, and look at that as a country with a racism problem. But Canada, in some ways, is no different. We have a racism problem as well, and again, that goes back to the very foundation of Canada, the very creation of it. And so I tried to give you a very, very short history. What we talked about is probably a good 300 years of history in about 5 or 6 slides. So we really, we really didn't cover anything. But I wanted to give you an idea that, this was the land of Indigenous people, right? This is where they lived and their ancestors had lived for thousands of years before Europeans came here. And of course, once Europeans did start coming here, things kind of rapidly changed, and not really for the better for Indigenous people. As we saw there, many of them died from disease. They were sort of pushed aside. Their cultures were, the government attempted to destroy their culture and kind of attempted to make them go away, right? Because again, they were kind of an inconvenience to the Canadian government, who was trying to build this kind of white European country here in Canada, and here, there's all these Indigenous people running around, and so the government sort of saw them as an inconvenience and tried to kind of make them go away. We said that making them go away, according to the definition of the UN, is basically amounts to a genocide, right? The government tried to destroy this group of people slowly and in many different ways over decades, right? And again, we read that article and we said that, even though, Indigenous people are still here, I mean, they weren't wiped out, and, you could make a case either way about whether the government meant to actually destroy these people. But if you apply the UN Genocide Convention definition, you will see that, the Canadian government has done all those things at one time or another. And so, again, whether you want to, put the label of genocide on this or not, what's happened to Indigenous people here in Canada has been awful, right? And it's important for people like me to recognize that I have benefited from this, right? Because my culture, my race is now the dominant group in Canada. And so I have and continue to benefit from the marginalization and exploitation of Indigenous people. And again, I'm not okay with that. I'm just saying that it's important to acknowledge that is how this country operates, right? But I also said, so I said there's a legacy of this relationship. You cannot treat, an entire group of people in such a brutal fashion for hundreds of years and then expect everything to be fine when you want it to be fine, right? Things are not fine. And so, again, if we look at some of the big societal numbers, you'll see that Indigenous people are more often unemployed. They make less money on average than do non-Indigenous Canadians. They're less likely to graduate high school. If you measure their overall well-being with the Human Development Index here, as is that the UN or the World Bank? I forget whose statistic that is, but you'll see that again their outcomes are lower, right? And again, we are 8th in the world in terms of our Human Development Index here in Canada, but somehow our First Nations are 33rd. Again, it's as if they are living in a different country than the rest of us, right? That's a problem. That's a red flag. That's a little alarm bell, right? This isn't focused on Indigenous people, but this one is here. The idea that, again, Indigenous people are heavily overrepresented in the prison population. They are only 3% of the Canadian population, and yet 26% of people in prison are Indigenous, right? Again, ding, 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 alarm bells should be going off. That's a big, big overrepresentation, right? Something is up, right? If you look at their life expectancies are about 8 years below the average. Again, that's a big difference because that's a big statistic, right? Statistics Canada is taking data for the entire country, right? That's a huge data set, and there's an 8-year difference. That's massive, right? That's massive. You see suicide rates. Good morning. You see suicide rates that are 5, 6, 10 times higher than non-Indigenous youth. Again, red flag, alarm bells, right? Something is wrong, right? And so really in many aspects of society, we see that Indigenous people enjoy, less beneficial outcomes. They make less. They're more likely to be unemployed. There is still racism and discrimination towards Indigenous people. There is the fact that they are trying to heal from decades of mistreatment, and there's a lot of stuff, right? And again, if you think back to the genocide article, there's a lot of stuff we didn't even talk about, right? We didn't talk about the 60s scoop. We didn't talk about forced sterilizations. We haven't talked about any of those things, right? We haven't talked about the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. We've barely talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's lots of other pieces to this story that we've really just driven by, right? Because it's a big story. There's a lot to know, and we just don't have time to sort of deal with all of it. And so I'm trying to give you the very quick tour of what's been going on here in Canada, and also kind of where we are right now, because that's what today is kind of about. Is that yes, we have a long history with Indigenous people. Yes, they are the first people to live here in what we now call Canada. Yes, they have traditional cultures and ways of life that go back thousands of years, and those ways of life extend right until now, right? Those are the same cultures, but up until maybe a couple hundred years ago, there were still people here in what we now call Vancouver, hunting and fishing and trapping and collecting shellfish from the bays, and living in wooden structures and doing all that stuff. That was a blink of an eye, right? That just happened, right? In terms of history, obviously for us 200 years is a long time, but in historical terms, that was just happening, right? So those cultures have a long history, but again, these people aren't trapped in it, right? So it's important that we think of Indigenous people not as a culture that belongs in a museum, or people that lived in the past. Those people still live here, right? And they live alongside us here in in Vancouver and in BC. And so I think it's important to know the history and know the past, but also have some understanding of what's happening right now in the present. And so again, that's what we'll kind of look at today. We'll look at it by watching this documentary, Eighth Fire. And Eighth Fire is kind of interesting. It was made by CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and there's a bunch of parts to it. I think there's either 4 or 6 parts. We'll just watch one, but they all have kind of a different theme. And so if what you see is really interesting to you, fortunately, there are 4 or 5 more episodes of it that you can watch on your own if you like. So this one is about Indigenous people living in cities. And so, often we think of Indigenous people as people who live outside of the city, on the reserve, in the bush kind of thing. But really, Indigenous people have been and continue to live alongside us in cities. And so what we'll be able to see here is kind of a little window into the world of some Indigenous people. Some who are doing really well, some who are struggling, some who are, pushing back against racism and discrimination and a history of colonialism, and we'll kind of see all of that. We'll get to meet a bunch of different people. It's hosted by this guy. This guy is Wab Canoe. Wab has kind of an interesting backstory. He's an Indigenous person from Ontario. In the past, he has been a musician, so he had a short rap career, believe it or not, before he went on to kind of broadcasting and hosting. And now he's actually the leader of the NDP party in Manitoba. So now he's entered politics. So he's done a lot of things, Wab Canoe has, but he's kind of a cool guy. So he'll host this documentary. So this is what we'll watch. Of course, I have a few questions for you. For online people, I have what's going on here? For online people, I'm just going to post these in Microsoft Teams, and I think I've got them ready to go, and I do. There. So for online people, I've posted them in Microsoft Teams for you, and I'll just go through them really quickly. So first thing, what kind of stereotypes exist surrounding First Nations people? You may already know some of these, or you may not, depending on who you've talked to and how long you've been in Canada. I certainly know what the stereotypes are, but they'll review them for us here. Why are a disproportionate number of First Nations kids not finishing school? Okay, so lots of First Nations kids don't graduate high school. Why is that? What is Canada founded on? And so there's this woman named Lee Maracle. She's going to express her views on what Canada was founded on. We'll meet an artist, a prominent Canadian artist named Kent Monkman. Kent actually just had an exhibit of his art over at Museum of Anthropology on the UBC campus. I think it was back in January, so the exhibition is over now, but but they were showing his work there. Good morning. How do people become trapped in places like Vancouver's downtown east side? So we'll meet a couple of people that are sort of living in that part of the city and what their life is like and how they've kind of become trapped there. And the last question here, that Canada's First Nations people are a living culture, but a culture that's in recovery. And so in what ways are they reimagining and sort of reclaiming their identities and their cultures? Okay, that's what I'm looking for out of this. So any questions before we kind of jump into this? Oh no? Okay. Let's do, as usual, let's watch 25 minutes of this, then we'll take a break. We'll come back and we'll talk about some of the things that we've seen, okay? So online people, same thing. Watch the first 25 minutes. The link is in Microsoft Teams. We'll take a break and then we'll come back and talk about some of these, okay? So see you in just a little bit. Okay, and we are back. So we've seen quite a few things actually so far, but let's start right at the very beginning. They gave us some people named some of the stereotypes that circulate around First Nations and Indigenous people in Canada. What are some of those stereotypes? Lazy, yeah. What else? What's that? Drug addicts, yeah. Yeah, drug addicts, alcoholics, they're lazy. What else? What's that? Taxes? What did you say?
Gangsters.
Oh, gangsters, yeah, that there's lots of people joining gangs. Taxes, what was it about taxes? Did you catch that?
They have to pay high taxes.
It's actually the other way around. It's actually there's the perception that they don't pay any at all, which is not true. There is, I believe, the rule is that it's either no income tax or a lower rate of income tax is paid if you make your living on the reservation. But so few people actually work on the reservation that it makes no difference. As soon as you have a job off the reservation, you're paying income tax just like the rest of us. So, but there is a perception that First Nations people don't pay taxes, but indeed they do. Anything else? Any other stereotypes that were mentioned? Okay. So what do we do? Okay, so right, so they gave us that. Then they were talking to the guys from Winnipeg's Most, right? And so those three guys they're musicians, and they were talking about why do, in their opinion, why are First Nations kids not finishing school? Could be, yeah. It could be students, could be teachers. Yeah, they don't feel included. They don't feel that there's kind of a place for them at those schools, right? And so they leave, right? And I think the one woman there, Leslie Varley, I think she said exactly what we're talking about here. She said that there's a lot of internalized oppression with Indigenous people, right? So it's just like the Jane Elliott experiment with the blue-eyed and the brown-eyed kids, right? There's a lot of negative stereotypes about Indigenous people. They are pervasive in Canadian society, as in they're everywhere. And Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous kids, have absorbed those stereotypes, right? And we saw that in the Jane Elliott experiment. Look how quickly those kids absorbed the idea that blue-eyed kids aren't as smart, and they started acting that way, right? And that was just in one little classroom in one little experiment, right? But consider the effect of that happening, but at a societal level, right? Where these kids are getting messages from everywhere and from everyone that, Indigenous people are lazy or not as smart, or they're all gang members, or they're all drug addicts or alcoholics, or whatever negative stereotype you want to choose. These kids are getting exposed to it all the time. And so, again, if it worked so well in Jane Elliott's class, it's going to have a pretty significant effect in society as a whole, right? And so, yeah, these kids aren't going to stay in school if they feel that they're not wanted there, if there's no place for them there, if they're not going to succeed anyway because they're Indigenous, right? And so they leave. And what do they do if they leave school early? Yeah, so that's kind of what the guys from Winnipeg's Most are saying, is that you find your way into crime, right? If you don't feel you belong anywhere, if you don't have any way to make money, if you're having trouble getting a job, either because you don't have a high school diploma or because you're facing racism or discrimination, crime is kind of the way to go, right? And gangs as well. And most people, I think, would agree that, young people join gangs because they're looking for that feeling of belonging, right? And gangs are very good at sort of acting like a family, right? It's a very tough family, right? And there's a lot of violence associated with it, but it's still a family. It's still a thing that you can feel a part of, right? And so, yeah, lots of kids don't feel they belong at home. They don't feel they belong at school, but the gang will give them a feeling of acceptance. The gang will give them a feeling of belonging to something. The idea that other people are watching out for them. Other people have their back, right? And so, yeah, some of these kids will join a gang, right? And it has to do with belonging and acceptance, right? And if they don't feel it at school or at home, they will search it out in other places, right? You had a question face. That's a tired face? Okay. We were speaking to that writer and teacher, I believe, Lee Miracle. What did she say that Canada's founded on? The what? Yeah, she used a slightly different word, but yes. The dehumanization, she said the negation of Indigenous people. And that's exactly the same thing that we talked about. If you're going to go into someone's land and take it from them and treat them in an awful way, you need a justification for that, right? You need an explanation. And the explanation was that, these people are not, somehow they are less than human, right? They're not as smart. Look how primitive they are, running around with their bows and arrows, shooting buffalo and eating the meat, while us Europeans are fancy and we have technology and things like that. People, they were looked down upon, right? They were seen as not as sophisticated, not as intelligent, not as worthy of kind of basic respect, right? And so Lee says, that, the official story of Canada might be that it was founded on, bravery or courage or, a spirit of adventure or whatever, the official story of Canada might read. But Lee says actually it's founded on negation, right? It's founded on the ability of people to push aside Indigenous people who lived here, right? This was their home. What did you get out of Kent Monkman's art? He's got some wild stuff. If you Google him, if you Google Kent Monkman and you look at some of his artwork, it's pretty wild. It's pretty wild stuff. And maybe I'll just give you a minute to Google it, to Google Kent Monkman. Some of his pieces are a little more tame, but some of them are pretty wild. And actually, there was quite a bit of controversy about one of his paintings, maybe about 6 or 8 months ago, where he felt people felt he had actually gone a little too far, and so he was forced to kind of apologize for it. But you can see there's some pretty wild imagery there. And do you remember in the documentary what he was saying, or what they were saying about his art? What was it trying to do? What's the purpose of Kent Monkman's art? What is it trying to do? Not quite. Not quite. Um, it, I guess maybe, right? Like it's, in a way, that's kind of the purpose of all art, right? Is to get people having a conversation about it. If people see your artwork and they don't say anything about it, you're not succeeding as an artist, right? Art makes people talk about it, right? And so that's what Kent Monkman is trying to do. And again, if you've Googled and looked at some of his images, there's stuff to talk about there, right? They're pretty wild. In a way, right? It has to do with who's with seeing and being seen, right? And we talked about this, I think, in the sexism unit when we talked about Ariana Grande. Remember when we talked about the male gaze? We said that if we look at Ariana Grande's video, I asked you the question of whose eyes are we looking through, right? Are we seeing her through the eyes of a man or through the eyes of a woman? And you may have had different ideas about that, but that was the question I was asking you. And what Kent is saying is that, in many cases, the colonizer, the white European, is the one who's looking at the indigenous person. It's the white person who is defining what the indigenous person is. And they use those, George Catlin, the artist who he drew like an Indian on a horse chasing a buffalo and shooting it with a bow and arrow. There's lots of those types of photos out there, or paintings out there. But those are all like how white people see indigenous people, right? And so it's the colonizer's gaze. We're seeing these people through the eyes of white Europeans. And Kent is trying to switch that around and say, hey, I know you're looking at us, but we're looking at you too, and here's what we see. And so he's turning it around, right? He's making the white Europeans the subject of the indigenous gaze, right? And what does that indigenous person see when they look at Canada, or when they look at how white Europeans see indigenous people? So again, it's a see and being seen thing, right? Who's defining whom, and who has the power? The one who's seeing or the one who is being seen? Huh? Yeah, the person who's looking, right? The person who's looking is the person who's defining what they see, right? The person who's being seen is kind of passive, right? Is less powerful. And so Kent Monkman is trying to turn that around and say, hey, I have the power now, right? I'm going to show you, when I look at you white colonizers, I'm going to show you what I see, right? I'm going to poke fun at you. I'm going to do things that are embarrassing. Did anyone Google the one where it's a beautiful nature scene and then there's an indigenous guy and he's spanking the bare butt of someone? Did you see that one? Oh, he's on the video, yeah. And the guy he's spanking is an RCMP officer in their traditional kind of uniform. So it's a government police officer that the indigenous guy is spanking, which again is kind of, there's a little bit of playful sexuality there. There might be a little bit of homosexuality thing going on there. But there's also a reversal of that power thing, right? Because who's in charge there? The government officer or the indigenous guy, right? The indigenous guy is now in charge. And Kent does a lot of that, where he flips it around and he shows you what he sees in Canada as an indigenous person, and he flips the power relationship around so that indigenous people have the power in his images, right? They're the ones who are seeing. They're the ones who are defining what they see. What's that?
Like after him making fun of the white people.
Uh-huh.
In the government, all those guys make problems for him.
No. There's nothing they can do. The only one that let me just see here. Give me 1 second. Since we're talking about this, Kent Monkman Trudeau. Where is it? Okay. Do they have a picture of it here or not so much? Okay. So there was a bit of controversy a little while ago, and it was about. Let me just put this on the screen for you here. Nope, that's not the right screen. Nope, this is the right screen here. Okay, so he was asked to issue an apology for one of his paintings because it appeared to show Justin Trudeau being sexually assaulted by a bunch of Indigenous women. And so, oh yeah, so here it is. So pretty racy kind of stuff, right? And you can see here, this is inside of an Indigenous, kind of a traditional Indigenous house structure, right? So this is where you are. And so you can see on the inside that wooden structure on the left, you can see those are a bunch of Canadian kind of politicians, and in the front there is, good morning, in the front is John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister. And so this is the thing that this is where the artist tries to get people talking, right? The artist tries to show something that is shocking to get people to have a conversation. And in that sense, the painting was effective. People had a lot of conversations about this piece of art. But it's also possible for the artist to go too far. And some people, let me just see here. Oh yeah, and where's Miss? Oh, that's Miss Chief, right? With standing up there on the right. Let me see here. Yeah, so some viewers suggested that in their comments that the image he was valorizing violence, so he was making the violence seem acceptable rather than critiquing it. And of course, we do know that Indigenous women in Canada are far more likely to suffer sexual violence and physical violence and other kinds of violence than really any other demographic in the country. And so here in the image, for the Indigenous women, who you can see are all laughing and having a good time around here, for them to be kind of enjoying this expression of sexual violence just kind of rubbed people the wrong way. And so so you can see here he made a written apology and said that he didn't really intend for people to perceive the piece of work that way, but they did, and he apologized, right? But but you can see in that painting, he's very clearly doing what he's done before, just at a more extreme way. He is turning things around, right? And he's giving the power back to Indigenous people, and he's showing what Indigenous people, or at least what he sees when he looks at Canada, right? So again, it's provocative stuff, right? And people can have all kinds of reactions to it. Indeed, that's what art is for. Art is, good art makes you react in one way or another, right? Whether you think it's beautiful or funny or, or shocking or whatever it is. And, some people felt he went a little too far here, and so he apologized for it. But that's what his that's kind of what his art is doing, right? Is trying to show a different view, trying to take back the narrative, trying to reestablish the power of Indigenous people to look at Canada rather than just Canada looking at Indigenous people. And there's a difference, right? How do people get trapped in places like Vancouver's downtown east side? We met Herb Varley. How did he become trapped there? Or what's his story? The older Herb, not Herb Jr. who was doing the art exhibit, but the older Herb. What's that? Yeah, what was his story before he came back? Do you remember? Yeah, so he was working on a fishing boat for years. I'm kind of guessing that maybe he was one of these kids who left high school early and maybe didn't get his high school diploma. Went to work on a fishing boat, worked on the boat for years and years, but then when there was no jobs, he came back to Vancouver, but had trouble finding a job, right? He's probably a 40-year-old guy with no high school diploma and only experience working on a fishing boat, right? So probably not a lot of employment prospects, doesn't have a lot of money, of course, has to deal with racism and discrimination, and so kind of winds up, in the sort of low rent downtown east side. What else is kind of a complicating factor for Herb Sr.? What else has made it difficult for him to escape? Yeah, he's struggled with addiction, right? He said he's I forget, was it drugs or alcohol or both? It's both, yeah. So he's struggled with addiction and with substance abuse problems, and so that's going to make it hard for you to find or keep a job as well, right? Employers don't usually like it when you come to work high, or when you call in and you can't come to work because you're high or because you're hungover. Employers don't like that, right? And so, yeah, he kind of is stuck, right? There's not a lot of supports for him. He doesn't have an education. He doesn't really have any experience. People are going to look at him and people are going to discriminate against him anyway. He's going to struggle with the sort of societal messages that are being, circulated about Indigenous people. He's going to have a relapse now and again into drug or alcohol addiction, and that's just going to make it really impossible for him to improve his life, right? If he doesn't have that support, if he's not able to get education, if he's not able to get resources, if he's not able to get help with his addictions, yeah, he's going to be stuck, right? He's going to climb up a little higher and he's going to just slide right back down, right? There's no, if there's no support for him. Okay, so I think that's good. Does anyone have any questions or things that they wanted to ask about or point out before we go back into the video? Okie dokie. So online people will go back and we'll watch the rest of the documentary. I think watching the rest will take us right to the end of class. So what I'll do is I'll end the stream now just to save stream space, I guess. Go back and watch the rest of the video from 25 minutes to the end, and then we'll pick up that last question tomorrow. Okay, so I'll see you all then. Have a nice afternoon, and watch the rest of the video. Okay, so bye.